He walked in to buy a ring for another woman. He walked out knowing he'd destroyed the only family he ever had. 5 years. No calls. No letters. No explanation. Kang Ji-won cut Zaria Brooks out of his life like a surgeon removing something vital. Clean, deliberate, and without anesthesia. He told himself it was mercy. He told himself she'd be safer without him. He told himself a lot of things in the dark. Now he's standing in the doorway of Seoul's most exclusive jewelry boutique, and every lie he ever told himself is turning to ash in his throat. Because she's there. Behind the counter, more beautiful than memory allowed, and sitting on a velvet bench near the window, two little boys, 5 years old, same jaw as his father, same eyes as his grandfather. Drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you stay until the end, hit that like button. Let's begin. Boss. The morning started the way most of Ji-won's mornings started, with someone bleeding. It wasn't his blood. It never was anymore. The man zip-tied to the chair in the basement of Ji-won's Gangnam headquarters was a mid-level enforcer from the Shin Syndicate who had made the catastrophic mistake of skimming protection money from 3 businesses that paid tribute to the Kang organization. 43 million won. Not enough to retire on. More than enough to die over. Ji-won stood at the narrow window that looked out onto the gray November street, his hands loose at his sides, and said nothing while Park Dae-ho, his second, his shadow, his fixer for 11 years, explained the situation in the flat monotone of a man reading a grocery list. Behind them, the enforcer was crying. Not dramatic crying. The quiet, hiccuping kind that comes after a person has already accepted what's coming and is just waiting for it to arrive. He says he has a daughter, Park said. Most people have something, Ji-won said. He turned from the window. He was 34 years old and had the kind of face that looked carved rather than grown. Hard angles, deep-set eyes the color of winter river water, a jaw that hadn't softened since he was 19 and took his first punch from his father in a room very much like this one. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the enforcer's monthly salary. His watch was simple. He had never been a man who needed to display power. Power displayed itself. He looked at the enforcer for exactly 3 seconds. Take it from his organization's share for 6 months. Then let him go. Park blinked, just barely. Boss, I'm not repeating myself. He wasn't. He never was. That was the thing people who feared Kang Ji-won consistently misunderstood. They expected cruelty because his reputation was built on it, but the cruelty had always been surgical, purposeful, never indulgent. He had ordered worse than this. He had done worse than this with his own hands. But this particular morning, for reasons he couldn't name and wouldn't examine, he didn't have the appetite for it. Maybe it was the engagement. Park followed him upstairs into the main office, a long room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. The city was pale and cold in the late morning light, the river surface flat as tin foil. The Yoon family called again, Park said, setting a folder on the desk. Seo-rin's father wants confirmation that the ring has been selected. The engagement announcement is scheduled for the 15th. That's 11 days. Ji-won sat behind the desk and didn't touch the folder. I know when it is. He specifically requested something from Maison Eclat, the boutique in Cheongdam-dong. He says his daughter has her heart set on the designer there, some jewelry label that's been getting attention in the luxury market, Black-owned, international background, which apparently gives it the right kind of cultural cachet for the announcement photos. Park paused. He was always pausing in a way that communicated volumes without committing to any of them. He's already called ahead. They're expecting a representative from the Kang organization this afternoon. Ji-won looked at the river. Normally he would send someone. He sent people for everything. That was the architecture of his life. Layers of intermediaries between him and the ordinary world so that nothing could reach him that hadn't been filtered and evaluated and deemed safe. But Old Man Yoon was the kind of man whose pettiness ran deep, and if Ji-won sent a subordinate to select his own engagement ring, that slight would echo through the next decade of their alliance like a bad chord. I'll go myself, he said. Park's pause this time was longer. You want backup? It's a jewelry store in Cheongdam-dong, Daeho. Yes, Park said carefully. It is. Ji-won went, The boutique was on the third floor of a building that looked like money without trying to. Clean lines, imported stone facade, the kind of understated signage that told you the clientele already knew where they were going. The elevator opened onto a space that smelled like cedar and something floral Ji-won couldn't identify, with display cases running the length of the room and lighting positioned to make every piece of metal look like it was breathing. He stepped inside. He looked left. Display cases. He looked right. A young assistant, maybe 22, smiling with the practiced warmth of someone who had been trained to make wealthy men feel welcome without making them feel managed. "Welcome to Maison Éclat," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" "Kang Ji-won," he said. Yoon family called ahead. Of course, of course. Please, our head designer will be right with you. Can I offer you anything? We have... I'm fine." He moved further into the space, past a display of layered gold chainwork that caught the light in a way that was almost aggressive in its beauty. He didn't know much about jewelry. He knew what things cost and what they communicated. This collection communicated something he couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't ostentatious, it wasn't minimal, it was something in between that felt almost like a personality. Then he heard her voice, coming from the workroom behind the main display floor. Low, clear, slightly roughened, the way some voices get when they've been used hard all morning, explaining and directing and creating. He recognized it the way you recognize the sound of your own heartbeat after years of trying not to listen. He stopped moving. The young assistant was saying something to him. He wasn't hearing it. The workroom door opened. Zaria Brooks walked into her own boutique carrying a velvet display tray in both hands and stopped so completely, stopped mid-step, mid-breath, mid-everything, that the tray would have hit the floor if she hadn't caught herself. Just barely. Just in time. For a moment that lasted nowhere near as long as it felt, neither of them said anything. She was 31. She had been 26 when he last saw her, when he had stood in the doorway of her apartment in Itaewon and said the words he'd spent months rehearsing and destroyed her with them anyway. She had changed in the way people change when life has put real weight on them. Something more settled in her face, something that had finished becoming what it was going to be. She'd cut her hair shorter than he remembered. She was wearing a slim-cut black work dress and a single gold cuff on her right wrist that he recognized as her own design. He'd seen it photographed in a magazine 6 months ago, in an article he'd told himself he happened to read by accident. She recovered before he did. That didn't surprise him. She had always been the faster of the two of them when it came to collecting herself under pressure. What surprised him was how complete the recovery was, how quickly the shock sealed itself behind her eyes and left her face in neutral. "Mr. Kang," she said. Formal. Flat. The way you speak to someone you once loved and have since filed away under a category that has no warmth in it. "Zaria, I understand you're here on behalf of the Yoon family." She set the display tray on the counter with a steadiness he recognized as costing her something. "I have several pieces prepared for your consideration. We spoke with the family's representative last week about their preferences." She wasn't going to acknowledge it. She was going to walk him through an engagement ring selection, like he was a stranger with a budget. He respected it, and it gutted him simultaneously. He started. "Right this way," she said, already moving toward the main display case at the far end of the room. He followed, because what else was he going to do? And that was when he saw them. Two small boys, 5 years old, seated on a velvet bench along the far wall with a tablet between them, wearing matching dark blue sweaters and the focused expressions of children who had been given a very specific task. Sit there, don't touch anything, be quiet. And were taking the assignment seriously. One of them had his tongue pressed to his upper lip in concentration. The other was watching Ji-won with a stillness that was completely out of proportion to his age. Ji-won stopped walking. He was not a man who stopped. He had been in rooms with the most dangerous men in South Korea and kept his stride even and his face clear. He had received news of betrayals, deaths, the near collapse of his entire operation, and not stopped walking. He stopped walking now. The boys were identical in the way twins are identical, which is to say, not completely, but in all the ways that matter first. Same bone structure, same dark eyes, same broad forehead that Ji-won had seen every morning of his own life in the mirror. The one who had been watching him tilted his head slightly to the right, assessing, and Jiwon felt something move through his chest that had no name he was willing to give it. Those are... He couldn't finish the sentence. My sons, Zarya said, and her voice had changed. Not by much, but he heard it. Elias and Micah. They're 5. A beat, then quieter and harder. Don't. Zarya. Don't, she said again, and this time it wasn't a request. The boy who had been watching him, Micah, he would learn later, always Micah, hadn't looked away. There was something in that gaze that made Jiwon's skin feel like it had been turned inside out. Not accusation, not recognition, something more uncomfortable than either, something patient. The other boy, Elias, had looked up from the tablet now, clocking the tension in the room the way children do. Not with understanding, but with their entire bodies, some animal antenna rotating toward the disturbance. Jiwon looked at Zarya. She looked back at him, and in her eyes he saw the thing she was refusing to say, the thing she was refusing to confirm or deny. And the refusal itself was the confirmation because Zarya Brooks had never been a person who flinched from direct truth unless the truth was something she was protecting. She was protecting them. From him. He turned back to the display case because he had to turn somewhere. Because standing in the middle of a jewelry boutique with the woman he'd destroyed and 2 5-year-old children who had his grandfather's eyes was not something his internal architecture had any framework for. He had frameworks for everything. Interrogations, negotiations, betrayals, the specific emotional geometry of violent confrontation. He had no framework for this. Show me the rings, he said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that in the way you're proud of things that cost more than they should. Zarya pulled a tray from beneath the counter. Her hands were completely steady. He wanted to ask her how she'd learned that, whether she'd had to practice it or whether it had come from necessity, whether she had spent 5 years making herself into something that didn't shake around him so that she could protect 2 children who... He made himself look at the rings. There were 6 of them. The designs were unlike anything he'd seen in conventional high-end jewelry. There was architecture in them, intention, a signature sensibility that moved through each piece like a shared language. One in particular caught him. Platinum band, a central stone flanked by 2 smaller ones in a setting that looked like it was in motion, like the stones were being held in a current rather than fixed in place. This one, he said. That's called the trident setting, Zarya said behind him. It's not typically selected for engagement rings. It's more the design. Who designed it? A pause. I did. He picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. I want this one. It's not appropriate for an engagement ring, Mr. Kang. The symbolism of a trident setting in Korean, I'm not buying it for the symbolism. He set it down carefully. I'm buying it because it's the best piece in this room. He paused. Same as it always was. The room was quiet. Behind them, Elias whispered something to Micah. Micah didn't respond, still watching Jiwon with that unnerving steadiness. I need your measurements, Zarya said, for sizing. If you're purchasing for the Yoon family representative, I need to talk to you. You're talking to me right now. Alone. I have clients. After. Tonight. He turned to face her. Please. The word cost him. He wasn't a man who used it with any regularity. She heard the cost in it. He watched her hear it, watched something shift almost imperceptibly in her expression before she locked it back down. I close at 7, she said finally. I have to get them fed and settled first. I can't... 8 o'clock. Your address. You don't have my address. He said nothing. She went very still. You've been watching us. Not watching. I just... He stopped. The justification he'd been about to offer sounded, even inside his own head, exactly like what it was. Not watching, he said again, and this time made no effort to elaborate. Zarya stared at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't read. And he could read most people. It was a survival skill that had saved his life more times than his gun hand had. But Zarya had always been opaque to him in the specific places that mattered, the deep places where she actually decided things. 8 o'clock, she said at last. You have 15 minutes. After that, I'm closing the door, and we're done. He nodded. He left without looking at the boys again. That was intentional. If he looked at them again, he wouldn't be able to leave. The drive back to Gangnam took 40 minutes in afternoon traffic. Ji-won sat in the back of the car and stared at nothing and did the math he'd been refusing to do since the moment he saw them. 5 years old. He'd ended things with Zarya in late November, 5 years and 3 weeks ago. The boys were 5. He didn't need any other equation. Park was waiting when he returned. One look at Ji-won's face, and Park, who had been with him since they were both 17 and running collections for Ji-won's father, said nothing at all, just waited. "Pull everything you have on Zarya Brooks," Ji-won said. "Her shop, her apartment, who comes and goes. Who knows about the boys? Everything. Everything meaning everything, Dae-ho." He walked past him toward the stairs. And quietly, "Nobody else sees this." Park said, "Yes, boss," in the tone he used when he understood that something had fundamentally changed and was filing that understanding away without comment. Ji-won went to his private office on the 4th floor, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink, and sat behind his desk watching the light go out of the city. 5 years. He had made a choice that he dressed up in the language of sacrifice. "I'm protecting her. She's better without this. I'm doing it for her." And he'd believed it, or told himself he believed it, which in the moment had felt like the same thing. He had been 29 years old and 5 months into inheriting leadership of the Kang organization following his father's death, and the violence of those months had been extraordinary even by the standards of his world. 3 assassination attempts, 2 internal betrayals that he'd handled personally, a war with the Shin Syndicate that had left 11 men dead and reshaped the criminal geography of Seoul. And Zarya, who had been in Seoul on a design residency, Zarya, who had walked into a bar in Itaewon where he'd been drinking alone and sat 2 stools down and ordered whatever he was having because she'd said she was curious what a man who looked like he was having that kind of night was choosing to drink. Zarya had been the first real thing in years of things that weren't real, which was precisely why he'd cut her off. He hadn't told her she was in danger. He hadn't been honest enough to say, "I am a man surrounded by people who use what I love to wound me, and you have become the most obvious target in my life." He had instead stood in her apartment doorway and said things that were technically true, that they wanted different lives, that he didn't have what she needed, that she should go back to New York and build the career she'd been building before he interrupted it, and watched her face do something he still couldn't think about without his chest closing. She hadn't cried. That had been the worst part. She'd looked at him with eyes that understood, that had perhaps always understood this was coming, and she'd said, "Okay, Ji-won," in a voice from which she'd already started removing him. He had thought about her every single day for 5 years and told himself that was penance, not longing. He was beginning to understand the difference was academic. At 8 o'clock that evening, he knocked on the door of an apartment in Mapogu, a building that was clean and modest and nothing like what she'd had in Itaewon, which had been temporary and transient, and now this was hers, permanent, built for 2 small people who deserved stability. She answered the door in civilian clothes, dark joggers, an oversized cream sweater, reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She'd washed off whatever composure she'd been wearing at the boutique. What was in her face now was rawer and harder. "They're asleep," she said before he could speak. "You have 15 minutes. You said 15 minutes." "I know." She stepped back to let him in, but didn't go further into the apartment, stayed near the door in a way that communicated he wasn't being welcomed. He was being granted a limited access that could be revoked. The apartment was organized chaos, the disciplined disorder of a single mother running a business out of her own creativity. Sketchbooks stacked on the dining table, fabric samples pinned to a corkboard on one wall, children's drawings everywhere, taped at different heights, some barely reaching above the baseboards, which told him the boys had been doing this since they were old enough to hold a crayon, and Zarya had let them. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a hammer, a drawing in green crayon of 3 figures, 2 small ones and 1 large one. The large one had no face yet. Ji-won looked at it for exactly as long as he could afford to. "Sit down or don't," Zarya said, "but say what you came to say." He sat at the kitchen table. She stayed standing. "They're mine," he said. "You don't get to say that like it's a discovery," she said quietly. The quietness was the most dangerous thing about her when she was angry. She'd always gone quieter, not louder, the temperature in the room dropping rather than spiking. "You don't get to walk into my store 5 years later and act like you found something that was lost. It wasn't lost. You left." "I know." I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after you. She stopped. Started again, more carefully. 6 weeks. I called you. Did you know that? I don't know if your people even passed it along. I called 3 times. Then I stopped because I realized that if you wanted to find me, you would have found me, and you hadn't, which meant you'd made your decision. Zarya, I made mine. I made mine, and I came here, and I built this. And I have 2 sons who are healthy and happy, and have never asked for anything they haven't gotten from me. So whatever you think you came here to say, I'm not here to take anything from you. You're not in a position to take anything from me. No, he said. I'm not. I know that. He put his hands flat on the table in a gesture he was barely conscious of, the same gesture he used in negotiations when he wanted to communicate that he was putting down whatever advantage he held. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm not here to make threats. I have no ground here, Zarya. I know exactly how much ground I have, which is none. She looked at him. I just need you to know, he said, that I know they're mine, and that I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw today. And what does that mean? I don't know yet. It was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in years. It felt like something coming out of his body that had been in there wrong. I don't know, but I can't unknow it. She sat down across from him, finally, not relaxing, just redistributing the weight of having this conversation into a configuration she could sustain longer. Their names, she said, Elias and Micah. Elias is the one who talked to everyone at the store today. Micah doesn't talk to strangers. A pause. He watched you the entire time. I know. That's his way. He clocks everything. He gets it from... She stopped herself, whatever she'd been about to say, closing off. He didn't push. He said, Are they healthy? Yes. Are you Don't. He closed his mouth. They sat for a moment in the kitchen of the life she'd built without him, and the refrigerator hummed, and somewhere down the hall, one of the boys made a small sound in sleep, and Ji-won felt the specific agony of understanding exactly what he'd thrown away, and being unable to reconstruct it. The engagement, he said. I know, I read the coverage. Flat, no inflection. It's a political arrangement, the Yoon family and the Kang organization. You don't have to explain it to me. I want you to understand that it's not Ji-won. She said his name for the first time, and it stopped him completely. I don't need you to manage how I feel about your engagement. I stopped having feelings about your choices a long time ago. She held his gaze. I have feelings about my sons. That's where my energy goes. He nodded. 15 minutes, she said. I know. He stood up, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and turned back. I'm going to station some men. No. Zarya, the fact that I came here today, that I was seen in your boutique, people notice these things. Word gets back. If anyone in the criminal world figures out that I have children, get out. Listen to me. Get out. She was standing now, and the quiet had gone out of her voice, and what replaced it was the specific ferocity of a person whose primary job in life is keeping 2 small people safe. You do not get to walk back into our lives and start making decisions about our safety. That is not how this works. You don't get to be absent for 5 years and then show up and be the protector. You don't get that. I understand that you're angry. I'm not angry, she said, and the way she said it made him believe her, which was worse. I'm careful. I have been careful every day for 5 years. I have kept them safe every day. I don't need your men outside my door to remind my boys every morning that their father is someone who runs... She stopped, breathed. Get out, Ji-won. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk about the rest of it. He left. In the elevator going down, he stood with his back against the wall and his eyes at the ceiling and understood that he was in more trouble than any opponent had ever put him in, because there was no strategy for this, no leverage, no framework. The enemy was the distance between who he was and who those 2 boys needed him to be, and that enemy lived inside his own skin. The next 3 weeks were a peculiar kind of hell. Ji-won proceeded with the engagement. He met with old man Yoon twice and said the appropriate things in the appropriate register. He attended a dinner with Han Seo-rin, 27 years old, the eldest Yoon daughter, a woman who had been raised to marry strategically and had developed a brilliant cold intelligence in the process. and sat across from her for 2 hours and found her impressive in the way he'd find a very sophisticated weapon impressive. Appropriate awe, zero warmth. Seo Rin was not a fool. She knew exactly what this arrangement was. She'd been watching him across the dinner table with the focused assessment of a person tallying their assets and their risks in the same calculation, and when their eyes met, she smiled with her mouth only. "I've heard your reputation," she said. "Most people have. I've also heard that your tastes are specific." She picked up her wine. "I want us to understand each other from the beginning." "I'd prefer that too." "Good." She drank. "Then we understand each other." He didn't know what she knew. He didn't know what she was looking for. He filed her away as a complication to be managed and returned his attention to the problem of Zarya and the boys. He watched them from a distance that he increased or decreased depending on what his intelligence told him. Park had provided him with a full picture within 48 hours. The boutique's client list, the apartment's security situation, inadequate. The route Zarya took to the boys' school every morning, predictable. And the names of the 3 people who knew the boys' full parentage. 3 people. In 5 years, Zarya had told 3 people. Her mother, who lived in Atlanta. Her best friend and studio assistant, a Korean-American woman named Dana, who'd been in Seoul for 6 years. And the OBGYN who'd delivered the boys. 3 people. He didn't know whether to be relieved that she'd kept it that quiet or wrecked by what the quietness said about how completely she'd closed the door on him. He stationed 2 men near the boutique anyway, plainclothes, on rotation, with instructions to observe and not engage. He told himself this was precautionary. He told himself he was giving her the protection she'd refused without violating the terms she'd set. He watched a video Park pulled from traffic cameras. Zarya leaving the school at 8:15 in the morning with Elias holding her left hand and Micah walking slightly ahead, independent, already scanning the street the way Jiwon himself had always walked. Evaluating, not trusting anything at face value. He watched 30 seconds of it and told Park to delete the footage. Then he asked Park to pull it back up. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week, Zarya called him. He answered on the 2nd ring, which he never did. He always let things ring. "Micah asked me today where his dad is," she said. He was quiet. "I told him his dad lives far away and can't be with us right now." A pause. "It's not the first time he's asked." But today he followed up with, "Is far away the same as never?" He heard something in her voice that wasn't weakness. She wasn't a person who did weakness. He'd understood that from the first. But was its more adult equivalent, the thing that happens when you're strong for so long that even the memory of having help sounds like a foreign language. "What did you tell him?" Jiwon asked. "I told him no. I told him far away isn't the same as never." A beat. "I need you to not make me a liar, Jiwon." He was quiet again for a moment. "I'm going to be at the boutique tomorrow morning," he said. 10 o'clock. If the boys are there, I'd like to meet them properly." Properly. She said the word with a slight edge, not cruel, just noting the strangeness of it. "They've already seen you." "They've seen me. They haven't met me." A long pause. 10 o'clock, she said. "And you tell them whatever feels right to tell a 5-year-old, not whatever is convenient for you. Do you understand the difference?" "I'm learning it." He hung up. He sat in his office for a long time with his phone face down on the desk. The next morning, he was at the boutique at 9:55 because showing up late was a pathology he'd been trained out of before his voice broke. Zarya was behind the counter with Dana, who looked at him with an expression he'd describe as controlled hostility, organized as professionalism. The boys were at a low work table that had been set up near the back, doing something with colored pencils. Elias heard the door and turned around immediately. His face was open the way children's faces are before they learn to guard them. Instant, total curiosity, zero strategy. Micah kept coloring for exactly 3 more seconds, then looked up. Jiwon crossed the room and crouched down to their eye level, which put him at an awkward angle for a man his size, but was, he understood instinctively, the only angle that was appropriate. "I'm Jiwon," he said. "I know who you are," Micah said. Jiwon looked at him. "What do you know?" "You were here before. Mom got different after you left." He said it with the flat factual delivery of someone reporting observable data, not making an accusation. "She doesn't usually get different." "Micah," Zarya said quietly from across the room. "It's true," Micah said. "I know it's true," she said. "I'm not saying it isn't. Elias, who had been vibrating with the effort of not speaking, finally burst. Are you our dad? The question hit the room like a stone hitting still water. Jiwon felt every person in the space go still. Dana, Zarya, even the air seemed to wait. He looked at Elias, who was watching him with huge dark eyes, full of something that was almost hope, but was being kept carefully on this side of it, like a child who'd been disappointed before and was hedging his bets this time. He looked at Micah, who was watching him with something older and more guarded, a 5-year-old who had already started to understand that hope was a resource you rationed. Jiwon said, Yes. Elias threw himself forward, literally. A full-body launch that Jiwon caught by reflex, the small warm weight of him landing against Jiwon's chest with a force that was entirely out of proportion to his size. Small arms going around his neck with a conviction that brooked no argument. Micah didn't move. He looked at Jiwon over his brother's shoulder for a long time. Then he said, Why were you far away? Jiwon met the boy's eyes. He said, Because I made a mistake. A big one? The biggest one I ever made. Micah considered this with the solemnity of a judge. Are you going to make it again? And Jiwon, who had been making promises to dangerous men his entire adult life and keeping them through violence and threat and leverage, felt the weight of this question. From this boy, this 5-year-old with his eyes and his grandfather's stillness, in a way that no contract, no oath, no blood oath had ever landed. No, he said. I'm not. Micah looked at him for another long moment, then picked up his colored pencil. Okay, he said, and went back to drawing. Behind the counter, Dana was very deliberately rearranging a display tray. Zarya had turned away, and Jiwon could see from the set of her shoulders what she was doing. Not hiding emotion, she wasn't a person who hid things, but choosing where to put it, finding a place for it that wasn't the middle of her shop floor. Elias pulled back just far enough to look at Jiwon's face. Do you know how to play Crazy Eights? He asked. No, Jiwon said. Elias's expression was immediate and categorical. This was a problem, but it was a solvable problem. I'll teach you, he said. It's not that hard. Micah always cheats, but he thinks I don't notice. I don't cheat, Micah said without looking up. You count the cards in your head. That's not cheating. That's math. Jiwon looked at these two boys. His boys. The word sitting in his chest like something he hadn't eaten in years and was only now understanding he'd been hungry for, and thought, I would burn everything I've built to keep them safe. He knew, sitting there on the floor of Zarya's boutique with his suit jacket going crooked, and his youngest son teaching him card game rules with the intense pedagogical energy of a kindergartner who takes rules seriously, that this thought wasn't metaphorical. He would burn it. And somewhere in Seoul's criminal underground, the first whispers were already beginning. Kang Ji-won had a weakness, and people who wanted him dead were listening very, very carefully. That evening, in a sleek restaurant in Gangnam, a woman with perfectly composed eyes and a glass of burgundy she hadn't touched sat across from a man whose organization had been at war with the Kang family for 6 years. She set a photograph on the table. The photograph showed a jewelry boutique in Cheongdam-dong. In the window, 2 small boys in dark blue sweaters. I thought you might find this useful, said Han Seo-rin, and smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes because Han Seo-rin's smile had never needed to. The photograph stayed on the table between them for exactly as long as Seo-rin needed it to. The man across from her, Shin Byung-rak, 51 years old, the kind of ugly that comes from decades of deliberate cruelty rearranging a face from the inside, picked it up with 2 fingers like he was handling something that might be worth money, which, in the way he thought about most things, it was. Twins, he said. 5 years old. Seo-rin lifted her burgundy finally and drank. The mother is American, black. She runs the boutique in Cheongdam-dong. He was there personally last week, selecting the engagement ring. The last 2 words carried nothing. No bitterness, no irony, just information delivered in the register of someone who traffics only in information. He stayed 40 minutes. He came back the next morning. He stayed 2 hours. Shin set the photograph down. You're certain they're his. I'm certain of very little in this world, Seo-rin said, but I'm certain of that. She smoothed the cuff of her jacket with 2 fingers. What you do with certainty is your own business. She left before the check arrived. In the car going home, she looked out the window at the city and felt nothing she could name, which was the feeling she trusted most. Ji-won found out about the meeting 43 hours later. Park came to him in the main office with the expression he reserved for information that required the recipient to be sitting down, and Ji-won, who was already sitting, felt the particular quality of the silence before Park spoke and understood that something had fundamentally shifted. Shin Byung-rok had dinner last night with an unidentified woman, Park said. Our contact at the restaurant got a partial photograph. He set a tablet on the desk. The image was slightly blurred, shot at an angle from across the room, but the woman's profile was clear enough. Ji-won looked at it for 3 seconds. She initiated contact with him, Park said. She left something on the table. We don't have eyes on what it was. Ji-won stood up from behind the desk slowly, which was more alarming than if he'd moved fast, because Kang Ji-won moving slowly meant he was doing math. Where is Daeho right now, this exact moment? Boutique is covered. 2 men on rotation, same as, call them. I want real-time eyes, not rotation eyes. I want someone there who doesn't move. He was already reaching for his jacket. And I want everything we have on Seorin's movements in the last 2 weeks. Every dinner, every phone call her staff placed. Everything. Boss? Park stopped him with the tone he used once every few months, the one that said what he was about to say was something Ji-won didn't want to hear but needed to. If she's already made contact with Shin, then she knows about the boys, which means the arrangement is a problem for later. The boys are a problem for right now. He drove himself. Park hated when he drove himself, said it was tactically indefensible, and was correct on both counts. Ji-won drove himself anyway because there was something about the specific helplessness of being a passenger while moving towards something urgent that he categorically could not tolerate. He called Zarya on the way. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail, which punched a hole in his composure, and then it rang again on his callback and she answered, slightly breathless, with the ambient noise of the boutique behind her. What? She said. Not a question. The greeting of someone who sees a name on their screen and answers already braced. I need you to close the shop. A pause. It's 11 in the morning. I know what time it is. Close the shop. Take the boys somewhere that isn't the apartment, Dana's place, or Ji-won. The breathlessness was gone. In its place was the very careful voice she used when she was deciding whether to be frightened or furious. What happened? Someone in my world may have connected you to me. I don't have confirmation yet. I'm working on confirmation, but until I do, someone in your world. She said it slowly, separating the words. Your world. The world you told me 5 years ago I was better off not being part of. That world. Zarya, how long? Her voice had dropped. How long has this been possible? Since you walked into my store? Since before that? How long have we been? The moment I walked in and anyone saw me, yes, potentially. I didn't know about the boys. I didn't plan to. You didn't plan. A short silence that was full of everything she wasn't saying. Then, my sons, Ji-won. My sons have been potentially in danger for how long because you walked into my store to buy a ring for someone else? He had no answer for that. There was no answer. She was right, and they both knew she was right, and him acknowledging it wasn't going to move them forward fast enough. Close the shop, he said. Please. Another silence. I'm calling Dana, she said, and hung up. He drove the rest of the way with his jaw set, and the particular sensation in his chest that he associated with situations sliding out of the range, where skill and planning were the operative factors, and into the range where you were simply reacting, which was the range where people got killed. When he arrived at the boutique, the closed sign was already up. He sat outside for 11 minutes, watching the street with the trained eye that had never fully switched off, not in restaurants, not in sleep, cataloging the pedestrian flow and looking for the wrongness in it. The person who walked too slowly, the vehicle that passed twice, the gap in the pattern where a pattern should be continuous. He found nothing immediately actionable, which meant either there was nothing or it wasn't yet operational, and between those two possibilities he had no current method of choosing. He went inside. Zarya was behind the counter packing the display pieces into the security cases with the focused, efficient movements of someone who had converted fear into task. Dana was at the work table in the back, already on her phone. And she looked at Jiwon when he came in with an expression that was straight accusation, no diplomatic packaging. I need to stay here until I have confirmation either way, Jiwon said. He was talking to Zarya, but he could feel Dana's stare on the side of his face, like a lit cigarette. Zarya didn't look up from the cases. The boys are in the back. I told them we're having an early lunch. Good. It's not good, Jiwon. None of this is good. She clicked a case shut, hard. What does connected to you mean specifically? What is the actual threat? Because I need to know whether I'm pulling my sons out of school indefinitely or whether this is, I don't know yet. That's an honest answer. I don't know the scope. The not knowing is the problem. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were dry. This was the thing about Zarya. She didn't cry in the direction of danger. She went harder, which was both what he'd loved about her and what told him she'd been managing crises alone for long enough that tears had been filed under luxuries she couldn't afford. You've been stationed men outside my shop. I know you have. I saw them. I didn't say anything because... She stopped, started again. But because part of me thought, fine, it's what he knows how to do, and maybe it doesn't mean anything for us. It's just him doing what he does. But now you're telling me those men weren't enough. Those men are still there. This is a different layer. How many layers are there? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Dana said from the back, I'd like to point out for the record that I told you this. She was looking at Zarya, not Jiwon. 3 weeks ago, I said, Dana, I'm just Dana. I know. Zarya pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. I know what you said. Jiwon looked at the doorway to the back room. Through it, he could hear the low audio of a children's program, and underneath that, Elias's voice narrating something to his brother with the theatrical energy that seemed to be his default mode. The sound of it did something to Jiwon's decision-making process that he couldn't entirely account for and didn't try to. He called Park. I need the Shin organization's current operational status. I need to know if they've moved anybody in the last 48 hours, any personnel changes near Cheongdam-dong, anything that looks like pre-operational positioning. He listened. Then push harder. I need it in 2 hours. He hung up. Zarya was watching him. Pre-operational positioning, she said. It's a precaution. Stop. She held up one hand. Stop explaining it to me in softer words. I grew up in Baltimore. I know what pre-operational positioning means. It means people are deciding whether or not to hurt us. She put her hands flat on the counter, same gesture he used at negotiating tables, which he noted and didn't comment on. What I need to know is what you're going to do about it. I'm working on... What are you going to do, she said again, about the fact that my sons are in danger because you are their father? The question landed in the room and sat there. He looked at her across the counter with the display cases between them and the children's noise coming through the wall and the gray soul winter pressing against the boutique windows, and he said, everything. That's not specific enough. I know. He pulled out a chair at the small client table near the window and sat down, which surprised her. She shifted her weight slightly, recalibrating to him not being in motion. The Shin organization has been looking for leverage over me for 3 years. If Seo-Rin gave them information about the boys, they'll use it. The way it gets used is pressure. They threaten the boys to control me, or they use the boys to draw me into a position where I'm exposed. Or they actually hurt them, Dana said from the back room. Dana, Zarya said. She's right, Jiwon said. Or they actually hurt them. I'm not going to tell you that's not a realistic scenario because it is. He looked at Zarya. Which is why I need you to take them somewhere for the next 72 hours while I resolve the Shin situation. Resolve, Zarya said. Yes. What does resolve mean in this context? He met her eyes. You know what it means. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away first, which was the first time since he'd come back into her life that she'd done that, and he understood it wasn't weakness. It was the deliberate choice of a person drawing a boundary around what she was willing to know. I'm not taking my boys to hide somewhere, she said. I'm not doing that. I'm not teaching them to run. This isn't running. It's running. She turned back to him. I understand why you're asking. I understand the logic. But I have raised those boys to not be afraid of their own lives, and I am not going to... She stopped herself, breathed through her nose. Where would we even go? I have a property outside the city. Gapyeong. It's secure. It's your property. Yes. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. So my options are hide my sons in a criminal safe house or stay here where a criminal organization might use them as leverage. She put both hands on top of her head, a gesture he recognized as her physical language for being at the absolute limit. This is not the list of options a person should have. No, he said. It isn't, and I'm sorry. Don't. I know you don't want it. I'm saying it anyway. He leaned forward. I know what I brought into your life. I know I did it by walking through your door, and I know I did it by existing in proximity to you 5 years ago. And I know there's no version of I'm sorry that addresses the actual problem, but I need you to hear it from me in plain language. I'm sorry, and I'm going to fix this. Zarya looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Elias gets carsick on mountain roads. He blinked. What? To Gapyeong, the roads. He gets carsick. She was already moving toward the back room. Don't go fast, and there better be a TV. He exhaled. It wasn't relief. Relief was too simple. But it was something adjacent to it, the specific sensation of a crisis agreeing to be managed rather than spinning into the unmanageable. They left within the hour. Ji-won drove, Zarya in the passenger seat with her arms crossed. Not in anger, but in the posture of someone who has made a decision and is braced against the consequences of it. The boys were in the back seat, Elias with a motion sickness patch behind his ear that Zarya had produced from her bag, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been through this before. Micah, with a book he wasn't reading, watching the city pass outside the window with those steady eyes. Halfway through the city, Elias said, Where are we going? On a trip, Zarya said. Is it a fun trip or a serious trip? It's both. Elias considered this. Can there be snacks? Yes? Okay. He settled back, apparently satisfied. Micah didn't ask anything. He just looked at the back of Ji-won's head in the rearview mirror with an expression Ji-won couldn't fully read, which was a novel experience for a man who could read most rooms, most faces, most silences. This 5-year-old was opaque to him in a way that felt like looking at himself from the outside. The property in Gapyeong was a low modern house behind a perimeter that looked pastoral, and was not. Reinforced fencing disguised by landscaping, cameras in the tree line, 2 men already in position who acknowledged Ji-won with the minimal nod of people who'd been briefed and were operating accordingly. It had been a contingency property for years, used twice before when Kang organization operations had required someone to disappear briefly. Ji-won had never imagined using it for this. He stood in the doorway watching Zarya move through the space, evaluating it the way she evaluated everything, quickly, thoroughly, without sentimentality. She checked the kitchen, checked the bedroom with the bunk beds he'd had Park arrange at 6 that morning, checked the sight lines from the windows. She didn't comment on any of it. The boys took the bunk situation as an opportunity to negotiate extensively over who got the top bunk, which took 12 minutes and was resolved by Elias winning a round of rock, paper, scissors and immediately being magnanimous about it in a way that suggested he'd expected to win. That night, after the boys were in bed, Ji-won and Zarya sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table with coffee. They were both mostly not drinking, and the silence between them was different from the silences they'd been building toward in the boutique. Those silences had been managed. This one was just real. She gave them information, Zarya said, not a question. Most likely. Your fiancé. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. She found out about the boys and her first instinct was to use them. She's her father's daughter, Ji-won said. In their world, information is currency and every relationship is a transaction. And you were going to marry into that world. I was going to make an alliance. I wasn't... He stopped. Yes, I was. She looked at the table. The engagement. That's over. She looked up sharply. Don't do that on my account. I'm not. He held her gaze. She made a choice tonight that put my children at risk. I don't negotiate with people who make that choice. It's not sentiment, it's principle, she said, with an edge that wasn't quite mockery. Yes. Kang Ji-won's principles. She said it quietly, turning it over like an object she wasn't sure was valuable or just heavy. I remember your principles. They were very clear and they were very consistently applied, and they didn't have any room in them for me. They had too much room for you, he said. That was the problem. You were the only person I'd ever met who got past all of it, and I didn't know how to. He stopped. I knew how to protect an empire. I didn't know how to protect something I actually. Stop. Her voice was quiet again. Don't do it like this. Not tonight. We're here because my sons are in danger. We can have the other conversation later. After. After, he said. After, she repeated, and it carried everything neither of them were ready to say yet. The question of whether there was an after, what shape it might take, whether the distance of 5 years and 2 children and one catastrophic decision could be mapped across with something that looked like trust. His phone vibrated on the table between them. He looked at it. Park. He answered. The Shin organization moved 2 crews tonight, Park said without preamble. Cheongdam Dong and Mapogu, the boutique, the apartment. They hit the boutique already? 40 minutes ago. Nobody was there. They came up empty. They've been watching Mapogu for 2 hours, waiting. A pause. They know she's not there. Someone is managing them very carefully, boss. This isn't opportunistic. This is directed. Seorin. Tell me you have eyes on the Yoon household, Jiwon said. We do. And Shin's location? Working on it. Work faster. He hung up. He looked at Zarya across the table. She had heard enough from his half of the conversation to understand the shape of it. Her face had gone very still. They went to the boutique, she said. Yes. And the apartment? Yes. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said very quietly, My boys were supposed to be at the boutique until 4. We close at 7. They're always there. Her voice didn't shake. It was just accurate, and the accuracy of it was worse. If we hadn't left, we did leave. If we hadn't, he didn't answer. There was no answer that made it better. Zarya put her coffee mug down on the table, stood up, and walked to the window. She stood with her back to him, looking out at the dark Gapyeong tree line, and she stayed very still for a long time, and Jiwon did not say anything because he understood that she was doing something private and necessary and did not need his commentary. When she turned back, her face had completed whatever rearrangement it needed to make. End this, she said. Not a request. Not a plea. The flat, specific directive of someone who has crossed a line inside themselves and is now operating on the other side of it. Whatever it takes, end it. He looked at her. I know what you are, she said. I knew what you were 5 years ago. I'm not... She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. I'm not asking you to be someone else. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are. And I'm asking you to make sure my sons are never at risk because of who their father is, ever again. Do you understand what I'm asking? Yes, he said. Then do it. His phone vibrated again. This time the number on the screen wasn't Park. It was a number he didn't recognize, and below it, a text message consisting of a single image. The exterior of the Gapyeong property, taken from outside the perimeter wall, time-stamped 47 minutes ago. They already knew where. The phone was still in his hand when Jiwon was already moving. Not running. Kang Jiwon did not run. Had trained that particular panic response out of himself at 19, but moving with the compressed velocity of a man whose entire nervous system had just switched registers, from managed tension to operational urgency in the span of one image on a screen. Get the boys up, he said to Zarya. She looked at his face and didn't ask questions. She was already moving toward the hallway. He called the 2 men on the perimeter. The first picked up on half a ring. Northeast corner, anything? Negative, boss, all clear. You're wrong. Someone was at your wall 47 minutes ago. Find out how. He was already at the front window, lights off, looking at the tree line. The darkness out there was absolute and unhelpful. Second position, south fence, check in. Silence. He called again. Silence. He crossed the room in 4 steps and hit the lights. Dae-ho! Park picked up instantly. I'm dark on south fence position. I need backup at the Gapyeong property right now, and I need you to tell me how the Shin organization got this address. Park's pause was shorter than it should have been. That was the first thing Jiwon registered. The pause was short in a way that meant Park already knew something was wrong and had been deciding how to say it. Dae-ho, I'm working on it. You're working on it, or you already know. Another pause. This one felt like a door closing. Send backup first, Jiwon said, because the boys were in the hallway now. Zarya moving them toward the interior of the house. Elias still half asleep and confused. Micah fully awake, and carrying his book like a talisman, and Ji-won needed the next 60 seconds to be about physical safety before they were about anything else. He stationed himself at the front of the house with the gun from the kitchen drawer. The property had been stocked for contingencies. He'd made sure of it, and watched the perimeter while Zarya got the boys into the interior bathroom, which had no windows and a reinforced door that had been installed under the guise of privacy and had always been intended as a last resort position. 3 minutes later, backup arrived. 4 vehicles, 8 men, the perimeter secured in under 4 minutes with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed this kind of operation often enough that it lived in their muscle memory. The south fence position was found unconscious behind a drainage ditch, alive, hit from behind with something that hadn't broken the skin but had taken him entirely out of commission. Professional. The message it sent was not, "We're coming in." It was, "We could have, and we didn't. And we want you to understand the distinction." This was not an attack. It was a demonstration. Ji-won stood in the driveway in the cold Gapyeong night with that understanding settling over him like water finding its level, and he understood that he was being managed. Seorin wasn't using the Shin organization to destroy him. She was using them to move him, to push him into a position, to create a specific kind of pressure that would accomplish a goal he couldn't yet see the shape of entirely. He went back inside. Zarya was in the hallway outside the bathroom, not pacing, just standing with her back against the wall and her arms crossed and her eyes on the floor in the posture of someone doing internal inventory. She looked up when he came in. "We're secure for now," he said. "For now," she repeated. "Yes," she nodded once. She went back into the bathroom where the boys were, and he heard Elias's voice rise in a question and Zarya's voice answer it, low and steady, and Micah's voice saying nothing, which was its own form of communication. Ji-won sat at the kitchen table with his phone and his gun and the photograph of his own property taken from outside his own perimeter and worked the problem. He called Park again at 4 in the morning. "Tell me what you know," he said. "All of it. Not the version you've been deciding how to phrase." The pause this time was the longest yet. "The address," Park said finally. "The Gapyeong property. Shin's people got it 6 hours before you arrived." He stopped. "From who?" "From inside the organization." Ji-won's hand tightened on the phone, not dramatically. A small, controlled increase in pressure that was the only external sign of what was happening in his chest. "Who?" "I'm still confirming. Who? De Ho." Park said a name. Ji-won sat with it for 3 seconds. Then he set the phone down on the table, face up, Park's voice still coming through it, and looked at the kitchen wall. The name Park had said was Yoo Sung-jin, 31 years old. Kang organization for 9 years. He'd started as a driver and moved up through 4 positions to become one of the 8 people in the organization who had access to the full inventory of Kang properties. Ji-won had personally approved every one of his promotions, had attended his wedding 4 years ago, had sent money when his wife had their first child. 9 years. He had been feeding information to the Shin organization for an as-yet undetermined period, and in the last 72 hours, he had given them the one address that mattered. "How long?" Ji-won said. "We think—" Park hesitated. "We think at least 18 months. 18 months." The math ran itself automatically. 18 months of what, exactly? What had been compromised? What operations had been affected? What decisions Ji-won had made in the last year and a half that had been made while someone at the table was reporting back? The list was not short. "Bring him in," Ji-won said. "Already done." Park's voice had shifted into the particular register he used when he was managing his own discomfort through professionalism. "He's at the Seongdong facility. He hasn't said anything yet." "He will." Ji-won picked up his phone and ended the call and sat in the silence of the Gapyeong kitchen for 90 seconds. And in those 90 seconds, he did something he rarely permitted himself. He let the full weight of the betrayal move through him without managing it. Not grief. He wasn't a man who did grief on schedule, but the specific sickness of understanding that someone you trusted, someone who had eaten at your table and stood in your organization's most inner configurations, had been hollowing out the foundation for a year and a half. That sickness was real, and he let it be real, and then he put it somewhere it could wait and stood up. He needed to go to Seoul. Zarya was standing in the kitchen doorway. He didn't know how long she'd been there. Her expression told him she'd heard enough. "You have to go," she said. "Yes." "Are we safe here?" "I'm leaving 6 men. The perimeter is solid now." He met her eyes. "I wouldn't leave if I thought you weren't safe." She looked at him for a moment with that expression he still couldn't fully read, the one that seemed to be running a calculation that included variables he didn't have access to. "The person who gave them the address," she said, "is that person still free?" "No." She nodded. Something in her face settled. Not relief, something more complicated. The specific adjustment of a person reconciling what they know about the world with what they wish were true about it. "The boys," she said. "Elias finally went back to sleep. Micah didn't." She paused. "He asked me if his dad was in trouble." Jiwon said nothing. "I told him his dad was handling it." She tilted her head slightly. "Was that the right answer?" "Yes," he said. He left at 4:40 in the morning. The Seongdong facility was a building that appeared on no civic registry, occupying the basement floor of a legitimate supply company in a light industrial neighborhood that nobody drove through without a reason. Jiwon arrived at 6:15 as the city was beginning its gray morning assembly, and he went downstairs alone, which was unusual enough that the 2 men stationed at the lower level exchanged a look they made sure he didn't see. Yoo Sung-jin was sitting at the metal table in the center of the room. He had not been physically harmed. Jiwon's standing instruction was that nobody in his organization was touched before he had the first conversation, because pain before questions produced confessions rather than information, and confessions were frequently wrong in ways that information was not. Sung-jin was zip-tied at the wrists, which was a courtesy compared to what he'd earned, and he had the look of a man who had spent the last several hours deciding whether it was better to talk immediately or to try to hold out. When Jiwon came through the door, the decision resolved itself. Sung-jin's face went to pieces. Not dramatically, not tears, not collapse, but in the small muscular ways that faces go wrong when they're trying to hold a shape they no longer have the structural integrity for. Jiwon sat across from him and said nothing. Sung-jin said, "Boss?" "Don't." Jiwon's voice was quiet. That was the thing that made men in rooms like this go cold. Not volume, not threat, but the specific quiet that preceded something irrevocable. "Don't start with boss. You gave up that word when you gave them the Gapyong address." He looked at Sung-jin with the same level attention he gave everything. "Tell me how long and tell me what they have." Sung-jin told him. It took 40 minutes. The account that emerged was worse than 18 months and more structural than Jiwon had constructed in his worst-case modeling during the drive from Gapyong. Sung-jin had been recruited not by the Shin organization directly, but through an intermediary, a legitimate financial consultant who served 3 criminal organizations simultaneously and provided each of them with curated intelligence about the others. The relationship had started not with property addresses or operational details, but with small things, scheduling information, personnel movements, the kind of data that seemed low stakes until you understood how a careful analyst could triangulate it into something that mattered. It had escalated 14 months ago when the financial consultant had been replaced by someone who reported directly to Shin Byung-rok. At that point, the requests had become specific, and Sung-jin, who had a gambling problem he'd concealed from the organization for 3 years and debts that had become life-threatening, had complied with the specific requests. He'd compromised 4 operations, given up 2 secondary property locations, provided personnel schedules that had resulted in, Jiwon now understood, 2 incidents over the past year that had looked like bad luck. And 6 hours before Jiwon arrived in Gapyong with Zarya and the boys, he had given them the address. When Sung-jin finished, the room was very quiet. "The financial consultant," Jiwon said. "Name." Sung-jin gave it. Jiwon stood up. "Boss?" Sung-jin started. Jiwon stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. "Your wife and the baby are not touched. That's all I'll give you." He paused. "You know that's more than you gave me." He went back upstairs. Park was waiting in the vehicle outside. Jiwon got in and sat for a moment with the name of the financial consultant, a name he recognized, as it turned out, which was its own specific nausea, and then said, "The consultant's name is Bae Jun-soo. He has an office in Yeouido. I want him in a room by noon." Park said, "Yes, boss." And then after a moment, "There's something else." Jiwon looked at him. "We pulled Seorin's phone records. Her personal line, not the line she uses for family business." Park passed the tablet across. 3 calls to the Shin organization in the past month. The last one was 2 days before she met with Shin directly. Jiwon looked at the records. "She's been coordinating this longer than we thought," Park said carefully. "This wasn't a reaction to you selecting the trident ring. This was already in motion," Jiwon said. Yes, he understood then, with the specific clarity that arrives when a pattern completes itself, that he had been walking into a room that had already been arranged around him. The engagement, the Yoon family's insistence on the Maison Éclat boutique, the specific boutique where Zarya worked, the instruction to go personally rather than send a representative, none of it had been coincidence organized by fate. It had been architecture. Someone had known about Zarya before he walked through that door. Someone had positioned him to walk through that door. Seorin knew about Zarya before the engagement was arranged, he said. Park said nothing, which was confirmation. The whole arrangement was designed to surface the connection, force me to go there personally, create a visible association. He looked out the window at the Seongdong street. She wasn't reacting to finding out about the boys. She engineered the situation to confirm what she already suspected and then weaponized it. That would suggest, Park said very carefully, that the Yoon family's interest in the Kang Organization alliance was never primarily about alliance. No. Jiwon set the tablet down. It was about position. Absorb the Kang Organization through the engagement, or if the engagement fails, use what they know to take it apart. He rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand. Old Man Yoon playing both sides. Shin on one end, the engagement on the other. Whichever one lands. The engagement is functionally over, Park said, which means Shin is now the active play. Jiwon's voice had gone to the register it went to when he was past the point of emotional processing and into pure operational thinking. They'll move soon, before I can reorganize, before I can shore up the compromised positions. How soon? Days? Maybe less. He looked at Park. I need every person in the organization verified clean by tomorrow morning. Anyone who can't be verified is suspended with pay and held until this is resolved. We operate at reduced capacity and we don't care. He paused. And I need the Yoon family watched around the clock. Everything. I want to know if Old Man Yoon eats differently this week. And Seorin? Jiwon thought about the woman who had sat across from him at a dinner table and said, I want us to understand each other from the beginning, and how cleanly she'd meant it, and how completely he'd failed to understand what she was actually communicating. Seorin most of all, he said. He called Zarya at 9 in the morning. She answered on the 3rd ring, and he could hear in the background that the boys were awake, Elias's voice doing something theatrical, the sound of cartoons. It's more complicated than I told you last night, he said. I assumed. Her voice was steady. She'd slept, he thought. Not enough, but some. How complicated. The engagement was never what it appeared to be. The Yoon family orchestrated the situation to gain leverage. They knew about you before I walked into your boutique. A silence. They sent you there on purpose, she said. Yes. Another silence, longer. He could hear her breathing, steady and slow, the way she breathed when she was absorbing something she needed to absorb without reaction. The discipline of a woman who'd learned to process shocks privately and not let them live in her body's responses where other people could read them. How long have they known about me? She said. I don't know yet. I'm finding out. Could they have known when I first came to Seoul? Before the boutique? He understood what she was asking. She was asking whether the timeline went back further than the store, further than 5 years, whether she had ever been. Not safe. Not outside the orbit of this world he'd told himself he was protecting her from. I don't know, he said. I'm going to find out. Ji-won. Her voice had changed. Not broken. Zarya Brooks did not break in the middle of phone calls. It wasn't her construction. But something in it had become exposed in a way that the surface discipline usually covered. If they've known about me for 5 years, if the whole time you thought you were keeping us separate, I know. Then there was never a version of this where we were safe. He couldn't give her a different answer, so he gave her the only honest one. I don't know that yet. But it's possible. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. He heard her move, the specific sound of someone walking away from children into a room where they could close a door. And then the quality of the silence changed, became enclosed. When she spoke again, her voice was different with the door closed. Smaller. Not weaker. Smaller, in the way things become when they're being looked at directly instead of managed from a distance. I chose Seoul, she said. I came here on a residency and I chose to stay. I built something here for them, for us, because I wanted them to know both parts of who they are, Korean and American. I wanted them to know this city. A pause. If that choice was never actually mine, it was yours, he said immediately. Whatever else was true, that was yours. Was it? Her voice was flat now in a way that frightened him more than anger would have. Or did I walk into a city where people already knew I existed and were deciding what to do with that information? Did I build something here thinking I was free when I was actually already inside someone else's? She stopped. He heard her exhale. I need you to go find out the truth. All of it. Don't manage what you tell me. Don't decide what I can handle. I want to know everything. Okay. Promise me. I promise. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and felt the full-dimensional horror of the possibilities she'd articulated. That the life she'd built in Seoul, the boutique, the apartment, the daily walk to school, all of it had been done in a space that wasn't as free as she'd believed. That his world had extended its shadow over her even in his absence, maybe especially in his absence, and that his decision to leave her had protected her from exactly nothing. By noon, Bae Junsu was in the Seongdong facility. He was a different specimen from Sung Jin, 53 years old, a financial consultant with legitimate credentials and a legitimate client list that served as the scaffolding around his actual work. A man who had been operating in the information economy of Seoul's criminal world for 15 years and had the specific confidence of someone who had never personally been in a room like this before and had always believed he was too useful to end up in one. That confidence lasted about 4 minutes. Jiwon didn't use volume. He never had to. He sat across from Bae Junsu and asked questions in the same quiet register he used for everything. And the questions were very specific, and by the time the fourth one landed, Bae Junsu understood that the man across from him knew enough that lying was no longer a viable strategy, and the only calculation left was how much cooperation was worth. It was worth a great deal. Bae Junsu confirmed that the Yoon family had been gathering intelligence on Kang Ji-won's personal associations for 3 years. He confirmed that Zaria Brooks had been identified as a significant personal connection 14 months ago. He confirmed that the decision to arrange the engagement through the Yoon family had been designed with input from Shin Byung-rok, a fact that meant the Yoon family and the Shin organization, nominally rivals, had been cooperating specifically around the project of bringing down the Kang organization from the inside. And then he said one more thing. He said that Han So-rin, before agreeing to the engagement arrangement, had requested a comprehensive intelligence file on Zaria Brooks, personal history, family, the children, the boutique's financial situation. She requested the file, Ji-won said. Yes. When? 8 months ago. Ji-won looked at him. 8 months ago, she requested a file on a woman she'd never met, and 2 children she had no reason to know existed. She had reason, Bae said. And then, with the calculated precision of a man deploying his most valuable asset to preserve himself. The file on Ms. Brooks wasn't compiled 8 months ago. It was updated 8 months ago. The original file, he paused, reading Ji-won's face for how much this was worth. The original file on Zaria Brooks was compiled 5 years ago, 3 weeks after you ended the relationship. The room went absolutely silent. 5 years ago, 3 weeks after. When the wound was still open, when Zaria had packed her Itaewon apartment and started building a different life, someone in the Yoon family's intelligence network had been watching, had known, had kept the file current through 5 years of her life in Seoul, through the boutique, through the boys, through 5 years ago, 3 weeks after. Ji-won sat with that for exactly as long as he could afford to, which was about 8 seconds. And then he stood up from the table and walked out of the room, because staying in it with Bae Junsu for 1 more second was going to produce a result that wasn't useful. Park was in the hallway. Ji-won said, "The gala." Park's face shifted. What about it? Zarya's collection launch. When is it? 4 days. Park looked at him. Boss, that's the move. That's where they do it. He was already walking toward the stairs. A public event, Seoul's elite, press coverage. If something happens to Zarya and the boys at her own launch, it sends a message to every person in this city about what happens to people connected to me. And if I'm there defending her, I'm visible, exposed, distracted. He pushed through the door at the top of the stairs into the cold air of the loading dock. It's elegant. It's exactly how Seo-rin thinks. We cancel the gala. We can't. He turned. Zarya has $200,000 of inventory staged for that event. Buyers flying in from Tokyo and Paris. If we cancel, the boutique doesn't recover. That's 5 years of her work. He looked at Park. We're not canceling. We're going to let it happen, and we're going to be ready. Park said very carefully, that is an extraordinary amount of risk. Yes, Ji-won said, it is. He called Zarya on the drive back to Gangnam and told her everything. The original file. 5 years. He didn't soften it. He'd promised her he wouldn't, and he was a man who kept the promises that cost him. She listened without interrupting. He could hear her breathing, slow and controlled. The kind of breathing that requires active work to maintain when what's underneath it is the opposite of slow and controlled. When he finished, she said, They've had a file on my sons since before my sons were born. Yes. They watched me build my life here. Yes. A silence. And you didn't know? No. Another silence, then very quietly. I believe you. She said it like she was testing the weight of it. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Probably worse, he said. Probably, she agreed. He told her about the gala. He told her his assessment, that it was the target, that the risk was real, that he would understand completely if she wanted to find a way to cancel it and protect the boys. He told her that if she wanted to run, he would make that possible, would set her up somewhere outside Korea with more security than she'd ever wanted in her life. She said, I'm not running. Zarya, I already told you, I'm not teaching them to run. Her voice was steady, in the way that things are steady when they've been decided all the way down. I've been in Seoul for 5 years. I built this here. My boys were born here. If I run now, what do I tell them? That we left because their father's enemies scared us? A pause. No. We do the gala. You make sure we're protected, and we end it. It's going to be dangerous. I know what it is. Then after a moment, Ji-won, make sure they can't get to the boys. I will, he said. On my life. She was quiet for a second. Don't say that. They need their father alive. He didn't respond to that, because what it meant and what it cost her to say it and what it said about the place they were inching toward were all things that needed more than a car phone call to address. I'll call you tonight, he said. The next 4 days were the most operationally compressed of Ji-won's life, which was a high bar. He rebuilt the inner circle from 18 people to 9. The 9 he could verify with the kind of certainty that didn't leave room for interpretation. He repositioned every asset he had into a configuration designed for one specific evening in one specific ballroom in Gangnam. He pulled in favors he'd been banking for years, contacts in the police department, in private security, in the legitimate business world that intersected with his through channels that everyone understood and nobody acknowledged. He had one conversation with old man Yoon that lasted 11 minutes, during which he said everything he knew and watched the silence on the other end of the phone tell him everything he needed to confirm. When Yoon started talking, Ji-won hung up. There was nothing the man could say that was worth the time it would take to hear it. He did not contact Seo-rin. He didn't want her to know what he knew. Not yet. Let her think her architecture was still standing. On the afternoon of the gala, he went to Gapyeong. The boys were at the kitchen table with a puzzle, Elias attacking it with strategy-free enthusiasm, picking up pieces and trying to fit them by force of will. Micah sorting edge pieces first with the methodical patience of someone who understood that structure preceded everything else. Ji-won sat down between them and said nothing for a moment, just watched. Elias looked up. You're wearing a nice suit. Thank you. Are you going somewhere fancy? Your mother's party. Elias's face lit. The jewelry party? She said there's going to be chandeliers. He said the word like it was something mythological. There will be. Can we come? Jiwan looked at Micah, who was still sorting edge pieces and had not looked up, and said, Not tonight. Micah said without looking up, Because it's not safe. Elias blinked, looked at his brother. What? Micah put an edge piece down carefully. It's not safe tonight. That's why we're here instead of home. He looked at Jiwan then, direct and level. Right? Yes, Jiwan said. But you're going. Yes. Micah looked at him with those eyes that were going to be the end of Jiwan's composure one of these days. Because someone has to. Yes. Micah picked up another edge piece, turned it over in his fingers. You'll come back, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Jiwan said. Micah put the piece down in the right place. It fit. He moved to the next one without ceremony, and Jiwan understood that for this boy, his boy, this 5-year-old who processed the world through the same bone-deep pragmatism Jiwan had been born with, that exchange had been a contract, and contracts were things you kept. Elias, who had been watching this with his tongue pressed to his upper lip, said, Can you bring back a chandelier piece, like a crystal piece? I'll see what I can do, Jiwan said. He found Zarya in the bedroom getting ready. She was in the early stages, dress on, hair pinned, jewelry half decided. She had laid 3 necklaces out on the dresser and was looking at them with the evaluating eye of someone who knows that what you wear to a night like this is not decoration. It's a declaration. She looked at him in the mirror when he came in. The boys okay? She asked. Micah told me the venue wasn't safe and then went back to his puzzle. A small sound escaped her that was almost a laugh. He's been like that since he was 2. Diagnosed a situation and then just proceeded. She picked up one of the necklaces, held it against her collarbone. He's going to be something terrifying when he grows up. Yes, Jiwan said. He is. She put the necklace down, picked up another. In the mirror, her eyes found his. Are you ready? Are you? She looked at herself in the glass for a moment, not with vanity, with assessment, the same look she turned on a piece of jewelry she was deciding whether was finished. Then she said, Put this on me, and held out the necklace she'd chosen. It was the trident setting, the same design as the ring he'd selected, 3 stones in motion. He stood behind her and worked the clasp with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and in the mirror he watched the stones settle against her collarbone, and she watched him watching, and neither of them said anything, and the silence was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The Grandeur Hotel ballroom in Gangnam was the kind of space that made wealth feel like a natural law. Crystal chandeliers, each one the size of a small car. Tables set with the kind of precision that required 3 hours and a level. The Maison Éclat collection displayed on illuminated stands along the perimeter, each piece lit from below, so that the metal seemed to generate its own light. 230 guests. Tokyo buyers, Paris buyers, Seoul's financial and cultural elite. Cameras from 2 luxury lifestyle publications. A string quartet in the northeast corner. Waitstaff moving with the invisible efficiency of people trained to be furniture until they weren't. Jiwan moved through it with Zarya at his side and his internal architecture running parallel assessments. The exits, 4 of them, 2 visible and 2 marked emergency only. The kitchen access points, the positions of his 9 men distributed through the space in roles that required no explanation. 2 as waitstaff, 2 as security personnel for the event itself, 1 in the hotel's security monitoring room, 2 outside, 1 at the service entrance, 1 at the vehicle access point in the basement. He knew where Seorin's people were the moment they arrived, because he'd been studying Shin organization operational signatures for 3 years, and he knew how they placed themselves in a space. Subtle, professional. But there were tells if you knew where to look. The slight wrongness in a jacket's drape over a shoulder holster, the positioning of a man near a load-bearing column that had nothing to do with his sightline to the room and everything to do with his sightline to the exits. He counted 6 before the first hour was done. Zarya was in her element in a way that was striking, even knowing what was underneath the surface of the evening. She moved through the room and talked to buyers and explained pieces, and laughed at the right moments and fielded compliments with the specific grace of someone who has worked for something long enough that they know exactly what it's worth. Dana was beside her, tracking logistics, steering conversations. The collection was extraordinary. Ji-won could see it in the faces of the buyers, the way they looked at pieces with the focused attention that preceded significant decisions. She'd built something real. He watched her work the room and understood that this was not a person who needed saving. This was a person who had already saved herself multiple times without any help from him. What she needed was for the threat to be removed. He tracked the 6 Shin operatives for 90 minutes. They were waiting for something, a signal, a timing cue, a development that hadn't yet arrived. They were not yet operational. He used the 90 minutes to position his own people in response, a quiet repositioning that he managed through earpiece communication in the fragments of time when he wasn't in conversation. At 9:17, the lights went out, not gradually, not a flicker. All at once, the entire ballroom dropping from chandelier brilliance to absolute dark in a single instant, and in the half second before the screaming started, Ji-won was already moving. He had Zarya's wrist. His hand had found it by memory and instinct, the specific weight and circumference of her, and he pulled her toward him as the room erupted, guests screaming, chairs scraping, the string quartet stopping mid-note, the disorientation of 200 people suddenly without visual reference points in an enormous space. "Stay with me," he said, directly into her ear. Not loud. Calibrated. "The boys are in Gapyeong. They're safe. Stay with me." He moved through the dark with the spatial map he'd built during the first 90 minutes, keeping Zarya's wrist and moving by proprioception and memory toward the northeast corner, away from the main exits where he could hear the Shin operatives beginning to move. He hit an overturned chair with his shin and ignored the pain, cataloged it and set it aside, the body reporting damage that was irrelevant to the current task. His earpiece, south exit compromised, 2 of theirs. "Hold position," he said quietly. "Don't engage yet." "Main entrance. I see it." He didn't see it. He heard it. The specific sound of a door being held against someone trying to open it from outside. The calibrated muscle behind it. They were containing the room. Not attacking. Containing, which meant the attack had a specific target. He understood in the next 3 seconds what the target was. Not him. They had 6 people in the room and a contained space, and if they wanted him, they had him. They'd had him for the last 90 minutes. The target was Zarya. Seo-rin wasn't trying to destroy Ji-won. She was trying to take from him the thing she'd identified as his actual vulnerability. Not the organization, not the empire. Those things could be rebuilt by a man with his capabilities. She was trying to take Zarya, which would take the boys, which would take the thing he'd just found, and hadn't yet had time to hold properly. He pulled Zarya behind a display column and pressed his back against it, her in front of him, his body between her and the room. "Don't move," he said. "Ji-won. Don't move." His earpiece. "We've got visual on 2 operatives moving through the room. Northeast corner, your position." "I know." He felt rather than saw movement to his left. The specific quality of displacement in darkness that comes from someone large moving with professional intent. He waited. 1 second. 2. He came off the column. The first operative was closer than he'd estimated. They collided at speed, Ji-won taking a hit to the ribs that drove air out of him, and returning it with both hands to a position he'd assessed by the height and weight of the impact, and the operative went down hard against the edge of a display table. Metal and glass, the collection pieces scattering. Someone nearby screamed again. The second operative had a gun. Ji-won heard the mechanism rather than saw it, and dropped, the shot going above him, shockingly loud in the enclosed space. And the screaming in the room went from frightened to panicked, guests moving in every direction, the crowd itself becoming a complication. He came up from the floor and drove into the second operative's midsection, got his arm up and around, and the gun discharged again into the ceiling before it came free. He had the operative on the floor in under 4 seconds and hit the earpiece. "Lights, now!" The emergency generators kicked in. Not the chandeliers, the functional lighting, fluorescent and unforgiving. And the room came back into harsh visibility. 230 guests in various states of terror. Display pieces on the floor. 4 of his men visible and moving. The 4 Shin operatives who hadn't reached Ji-won were reassessing rapidly, the operational calculation shifting now that the dark was gone and the room had defenders who knew where they were. Jiwan looked for Zarya. She was not behind the column. His chest did something that wasn't fear. He didn't have a word for it. The specific biological response of understanding that something irreplaceable was in the wrong location, that the margin had just collapsed to something very thin. He scanned the room. Display tables, overturned chairs, guests clustered near the walls. Dana, near the main entrance, gesturing frantically at something Jiwan couldn't immediately see. Then he saw Micah's stillness in the wrong body. The same quality of absolute motionlessness that his son carried, but adult-sized and belonging to Zarya, who was standing at the far end of the room near the east display wall, completely still, because there was a man behind her with a forearm across her throat and a gun at her temple. The man was one of Shin's, not one of the 6 Jiwan had tracked. A 7th, positioned early, before Jiwan arrived, placed as a failsafe if the main operation was disrupted. Seorin had been more thorough than he'd credited. Jiwan stopped moving. Every person in the room stopped moving with him, the instinctive recognition of a situation that had reached its axis. His 9 men held position. The 4 remaining Shin operatives held position. 200 guests pressed against walls. The man with the gun said, loudly enough to carry, "Put the weapon down, Kong." Jiwan looked at Zarya. Her face was very still. Not afraid, but with the fear organized behind something harder, something that knew he was across the room and was working with that fact rather than against it. She was breathing through her nose, slow and deliberate, her hands at her sides and open, communicating to anyone who knew how to read her that she was not going to do anything reckless, that she was going to hold her position and trust him to close the distance. Trusting him. After everything, choosing, in this specific moment, to trust him. It moved through him like voltage. He set the gun on the floor. The man with the forearm at Zarya's throat said, "Tell your people to stand down." Jiwan said, "Stand down," into the earpiece. Then he straightened and looked at the man and said, in the quiet voice that was more dangerous than volume, "You have one exit that's still open, South Service Corridor. My people are giving it to you right now. Take it." The man's jaw tightened. "I'm not going anywhere without—" "You're not taking her," Jiwan said. Simple. Absolute. She stays. You can go, or we can do this the other way, but she stays regardless. The only variable is what happens to you. He paused. "You're not Shin. You're a contractor. This isn't your war. Walk out the South Corridor and don't come back to Seoul." A moment. The gun at Zarya's temple didn't move. Jiwan looked at Zarya and something passed between them. Not words, not signals. Something older than either. The specific frequency of 2 people who know each other well enough to communicate in the space between intention and action. She dropped her weight. Entirely, suddenly, all at once. Not a stumble, a deliberate collapse downward, her knees hitting the floor and her full body weight pulling the arm across her throat into an angle it couldn't hold. The operative lurched forward, off balance, the gun swinging wide. Jiwan was already crossing the room. The distance was 12 meters. He covered it in the time it takes a heart to beat twice, and by the time the operative had recovered his footing enough to redirect the gun, Jiwan had the arm that was holding it in both hands, and the joint went the wrong direction with a sound that was not loud but was very specific. The gun hit the floor. The operative followed it. Jiwan stood over him, breathing through his mouth, the ribs on his left side sending a sustained complaint that he was continuing to decline to acknowledge, and looked down at the man on the floor with an expression that communicated without ambiguity that the offer of the South Corridor had expired. He turned to Zarya. She was on her feet. She had risen from the floor under her own power while he was crossing the room, and she was standing now with her shoulders back and her jaw set, and the trident stones at her collarbone catching even the fluorescent emergency lighting and making it into something. There was a red mark across her throat where the forearm had been. She was looking at him with eyes that were doing the same thing they'd done in the Gapyong kitchen. The complicated calculation. The variables he didn't have full access to. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She looked at the mark she couldn't see but could feel. "Not really." He crossed the last few feet between them and stood in front of her and looked at the red line across her throat and felt the thing move through his chest again, the thing without a name, or with too many names to choose between. His earpiece, boss, outside, you need to see this. And then a second voice, over the general channel rather than direct. Police presence. Multiple units. Someone called it in. Looks coordinated. They're moving on the building. Jiwon looked up. Then his phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized as one of his police contacts. A man he'd been cultivating for 4 years against exactly this kind of night. The text said, "Warrant for Han So-rin. Conspiracy. Attempted murder. Her father too. Someone gave us everything." Jiwon stood in the middle of the ruined gala with Zarya 3 feet away and his men holding 6 Shin operatives at various points around the room and 200 terrified Seoul elite pressed against the walls. And he read the text twice. Someone had given the police everything. He looked across the room, past the overturned displays and the scattered collection pieces, and the guests who were beginning to understand that the immediate danger had passed and were moving from terror toward the particular indignation of people who expected their evenings to go differently. Near the main entrance, visible for just a moment before she stepped back through the door, Han So-rin. Not fleeing, not panicked, standing with the composed stillness of someone who had made a decision and was watching it execute. She met his eyes across the ballroom. She inclined her head very slightly. An acknowledgement, a punctuation mark on something that had just ended. Then she was gone. Jiwon stood completely still for 3 seconds, the operational math running at a speed that left his body behind, and understood that Seo-rin had just burned her father's organization to the ground, had handed the police a case built on information that only someone inside the Yoon family would have access to, had done it while her father's men were inside this building attempting an operation she had architected and then dismantled in the same evening. She hadn't been destroying him. She had been destroying her father. Ji-won had been the mechanism, not the target. The police came through the doors 90 seconds later, and the room, already still, became something else entirely. The suspended moment before the last piece of an architecture falls, when everyone can see what it's been and what it's. The police came through the doors, and the room became a different kind of chaos. Organized, official, the chaos of institutions asserting themselves over the wreckage of private violence. Uniformed officers first, then plain clothes, then the specific category of men who wore neither uniform nor the careful anonymity of detectives, but something in between, which told Ji-won that someone senior had decided this evening was important enough to attend personally. He stood his ground in the center of the ballroom and did not move toward the exits, and did not instruct his men to resist because the text on his phone had told him what tonight was, and running from it would be the wrong read. He put his hands visible at his sides and waited. The senior officer, 50s, heavy through the shoulders, the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything it encountered about 15 years back, crossed the room toward Ji-won with the measured pace of a man who didn't need to hurry because the room was already his. "Kang Ji-won," he said. "Inspector Wu," Ji-won said. Wu looked at the room, the operatives on the floor, the scattered jewelry, the 200 guests beginning to find their voices, the red mark across Zarya's throat. He looked at all of it with the comprehensive assessment of a man building a file in real time. "Long night," Wu said. "Yes." "You gonna make this complicated?" Ji-won looked at him. "I'm gonna make this as simple as I possibly can," he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything in a long time. What followed was not simple, because nothing involving the intersection of organized crime and institutional law enforcement at this scale was ever simple. But Ji-won had told the truth about his intentions. He cooperated. He gave Wu names, locations, operational details, the financial architecture of the Shin organization's relationship with the Yoon family, the intelligence network that Bae Jun-soo had been running for 15 years. He gave him everything he had on Sung-jin and everything Sung-jin had given him. He gave him the photograph of the boutique window, time-stamped, with the number it had been sent from. He sat in a hard chair in a police interview room from 11 that night until 4 in the morning and answered every question Wu and 2 other inspectors put to him without a lawyer present, which was the kind of decision that surprised everyone in the room except Ji-won himself, because having a lawyer present would have changed the texture of what he was doing from cooperation to strategy. And strategy was not what this night required. What this night required was reckoning. He was released at 4:15 with conditions: surrender of passport, regular check-ins, the implicit understanding that the case being built would require his continued availability and his continued candor. Wu walked him to the lobby himself, which was either a courtesy or a way of ensuring he actually left the building, and at the door said, "This goes well for you if you stay straight." "I know," Jiwon said. "I mean it. The DA wants the Yoon family and the Shin organization. You're useful to us in building that case. You're less useful if you're also a defendant." "I understand the math." Wu studied him. "Do you understand it enough to actually do it? Because I've had this conversation with men like you before, and the ones who say the right things in this room and then go back to—" "I'm not going back," Jiwon said. Wu looked at him for another moment, reading him the way experienced investigators read people. Not for what they said, but for the architecture underneath what they said, the consistency between surface and depth. "All right," he said finally. And then, with the very slight inflection of a man who is human enough to wonder, "The woman and the boys, they're yours?" Jiwon looked at him. "Yes." Wu nodded once, said nothing else, went back inside. Jiwon stood on the sidewalk outside the police building in the 4 o'clock Seoul dark and breathed the cold air and felt the specific sensation of a structure coming down, not collapsing, not falling, but being deliberately dismantled, piece by piece, the organized deconstruction of everything he'd built over 15 years of carefully applied violence and carefully maintained distance. It felt, unexpectedly, like breathing. He called Park. "It's done," he said. Park was quiet for a moment. "Which part?" "All of it." Jiwon looked up at the sky, which was beginning its imperceptible shift from black to the particular deep blue that precedes dawn in winter. "Start making calls. The organization dissolves. Controlled wind down. Nobody gets hurt. Everybody gets paid out what they're owed." He paused. "The legitimate holdings, the supply companies, the real estate, the consulting firms, those transfer to clean ownership. I'll give you a list of who to contact for the legal work." "Boss?" Park's voice was very careful, the way it got when he was managing something that had no precedent in his experience. "This is a significant decision to make at 4 in the morning. I know what time it is." "I mean—" Park stopped, started again. "Are you sure?" Jiwon thought about Micah at the kitchen table with his edge pieces, sorting by shape and color with the patience of someone who understood that the border had to be complete before the center could make sense. He thought about Elias launching himself across a room with no hesitation, no calculation, no protection of himself against the possibility of not being caught. He thought about Zaria standing in front of a gun and dropping her weight at exactly the right moment because she'd decided to trust him, and what that decision had cost her, and what it would cost him to deserve it. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. Park exhaled. A long breath, the kind that carries a great deal more than its length suggests. "All right," he said. "I'll start making calls." "Dae-ho." Jiwon paused. "Thank you. 11 years. What you did. What you've always done. I know what it was." Another silence. Park, who had been at Jiwon's side through every version of every terrible thing, said, "You were worth it." And then, with the very slight roughness of a man who rarely said things he hadn't first decided to say, "Go be with them." Jiwon drove to Gapyeong as the sky went from deep blue to gray to the thin winter gold of dawn arriving without conviction. The property was quiet. The 6 men on perimeter nodded him through, and he told them they could stand down and go home. And they exchanged looks and did it because an instruction that clear from a man whose instructions were always clear didn't require interpretation. He let himself in through the front door. The house was dark except for the kitchen light, left on overnight, the way you leave lights on in a house with children, so that if someone wakes frightened, they have something to navigate by. He stood in the entry for a moment and listened to the specific silence of a house where people are sleeping, which is a different silence from an empty house, warmer and more inhabited, full of the sounds of breath and the small sounds of children dreaming. He sat in the kitchen with a glass of water he didn't drink and waited for the house to wake up, which took about 2 hours. And the 2 hours were the most peaceful he'd spent in longer than he could accurately calculate. Elias came first, as Elias always came first, at 6:40 in a state of immediate and complete wakefulness that children achieve, and adults lose somewhere along the way. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Jiwon and said, "You're here," with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a person whose expectations have been met. "I'm here," Jiwon said. Elias came and sat at the table across from him. He was wearing pajamas with a cartoon bear on them, and his hair was doing something structurally ambitious on one side. He looked at the glass of water and then at Jiwon and said, with the directness of someone who had been thinking about something since before he came downstairs, "Did you fix it?" Jiwon looked at him. "Yes." "Is Mom okay?" "Yes." Elias nodded. He seemed to find this report sufficient. Then, "Did you get a chandelier piece?" Jiwon reached into his jacket pocket. The piece of crystal from the ballroom floor. A small thing, the size of his thumbnail. A fragment from one of the stands that had gone over in the dark. He'd picked it up without fully knowing why, some instinct toward the promise he'd made. He set it on the table. Elias picked it up and held it to the kitchen window, where the early light moved through it and threw small spectral shapes across the table. His face was a document of pure, uncomplicated wonder. "Excellent," he said. Micah came 20 minutes later, dressed already, book under his arm. He looked at Jiwon and then at Elias and then at the crystal piece, and then he sat down and put his book on the table and said, "You came back." "I said I would." Micah looked at him for a long moment with those steady eyes that had been evaluating him since the first day in the boutique, that had been running their own assessment independent of everything else. Then he said, "Mom cried last night after we went to bed. She thought we were asleep." Jiwon said nothing. "She doesn't usually cry," Micah said, not accusing, reporting. "I know. Are you going to make her cry again?" The directness of it landed on him like something physical, 5 years old and already carrying the job of watching out for her, already organized around being one of the people who stood between Zarya and the things that hurt her. Jiwon recognized it because he'd been doing a version of the same thing his entire life, and he understood what it cost, and he understood that Micah was 5, and should not yet be paying that cost. "No," Jiwon said. "Not like that." Micah considered this. "Like what then?" "The kind that's all right." Jiwon held his gaze. "The kind that people sometimes do when things get better instead of worse." Micah thought about this with the full weight of his consideration. Then he opened his book. "Okay," he said. Zarya came into the kitchen at 7:15. She'd slept. Not enough. Her eyes carrying the slight weight of insufficient sleep, combined with a night that had been too large for any amount of sleep to process. And she'd dressed already. A cream sweater and dark jeans, the trident necklace still at her collarbone, which Jiwon noticed and did not comment on. She looked at him. She looked at the boys. She looked at the crystal piece in Elias's palm. "You kept that," she said to Jiwon. "I said I'd see what I could do." She put her hand briefly on top of Elias's head as she passed, and Elias leaned into it without looking up from the crystal, the automatic comfort of a child who has always known that hand. She put water on for coffee and stood at the counter with her back to the room for a moment. And Jiwon understood she was doing the same thing she'd done at the window in Gapyeong, taking private inventory, finding out what she was working with on the other side of the night. When she turned around, she said, "Boys, go get your things together." Elias looked up. "Are we going home?" "Yes." Elias's face arranged itself into celebration. He grabbed the crystal and left at the speed he moved most things, which was full. Micah closed his book, stood up, and left with the contained economy he brought to everything. Zarya sat down across from Jiwon at the kitchen table. "Tell me," she said. He told her, all of it. The police, the interview, Wu's conditions, the decision about the organization. He told her about Seorin, what he now understood about the evening, the way she'd burned her father's operation with the same hand she'd used to try to destroy Jiwon's. He told her about Sung Jin and Bae Jun-soo and the 5-year file. He told her about Park's phone call in the Seongdong Dawn and what he'd said to Park and what Park had said back. He told her everything, and he told it plainly, without managing the parts that made him look worse than he was, because she'd asked him to do that, and he intended to keep being the person who kept that promise. When he was done, the coffee was cold. Zarya sat with her hands around the mug and looked at the table for a while. And Jiwon waited because she thought in her own time and at her own pace, and the worst thing you could do was interrupt that process. She said, 5 years. Yes. They had a file on me for 5 years and you didn't know. No. And if you had known, she looked up. Would you have done anything differently? The question sat between them. He took it seriously, which meant he didn't answer it immediately. He sat with it and found out what the honest answer was. I don't know, he said. I want to tell you yes. I want to tell you I would have kept you closer, protected you better, made different choices. But I was 29 and I was running an organization I'd inherited in blood, and He stopped. I was a person who didn't know how to hold something real without destroying it by trying to protect it. I don't know that knowing about the file would have made me a different person than I was. She looked at him. I know that's not the answer. It's the right answer, she said. It's the honest one. She put the mug down. I've been angry at you for 5 years. I built the boutique angry. I raised the boys angry. Not at them, never at them, but underneath everything there was this. She pressed 2 fingers to her sternum. This thing that I was constantly converting the anger into work, into design, into getting up at 5 in the morning and doing it all over again. Because if I stopped converting it, it would just be grief. Jiwon said nothing. And then you walked back in, she said, and the anger had something to do with itself again, which was almost a relief. A pause. Except it wasn't just anger anymore. It was never just anger. That was always the problem. He looked at her across the table. What do you want, Zarya? He asked. Not strategically, not as a negotiating opening, just the question, plain. She looked at him for a long time. I want my boys to know their father, she said. I want them to have that. Micah has been watching the door for something he didn't know how to name since he was 2 years old, and I can't take that from him. She paused. I want the boutique back. I want my life back. I want to not have to check the perimeter before I let my kids play outside. Another pause, longer. And I want to not be angry anymore. I'm tired. I've been angry for 5 years and I'm tired of it. You can stop, he said. I can't just decide to stop. No, he said. But you can decide to start something else. And stopping and starting aren't that different at the root of it. She looked at him with an expression he finally recognized, the one he'd been failing to read since the boutique. It wasn't calculation. It wasn't the assessment of risk against reward. It was the face of a person standing at the edge of something they wanted and making themselves look at it directly instead of sideways because they decided that sideways was a luxury they were done with. You're going to have to learn how to be someone I can actually trust, she said. Not because of who you were before, because of who you're deciding to be now. That's going to take time. I know. And you're going to have to learn how to be their father, not their protector, not their provider, their father, which is a completely different thing. I know that too. And you're going to have to be patient, she said, with all of it, because She stopped. I'm not going to be fast about this, and I need you to not push. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, testing the word. They sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, the Gapyong morning moving in through the windows, the sounds of 2 boys assembling themselves in the back of the house, communicating through the walls the specific organized chaos of children who have been told they're going home and are treating it as an event. Zarya reached across the table and picked up Jiwon's glass of water that he still hadn't touched, and drank from it and set it back down in front of him. It was such a small thing, the smallest possible thing. It undid him more than any of the rest of it had. The weeks that followed were the most disorienting of Jiwon's life, which was not a claim he made lightly given the life he'd lived. The organization wound down with the controlled precision that Park brought to everything, the process taking 6 weeks from first call to last. Severances paid, legitimate businesses transferred, intelligence handed over to Wu's task force, in the installments that had been agreed upon. 3 members of the Shin organization's inner circle were arrested in the first 2 weeks. The Yoon family's financial structure came apart in the 3rd, Old Man Yoon's lawyer filing a cooperation agreement before the month was out. Han Seo-rin was arrested on a Tuesday morning, which Jiwon read about in a news notification on his phone while sitting in Zarya's kitchen helping Elias with a jigsaw puzzle. She had cooperated, as he'd understood she would. Her cooperation was the instrument of her father's destruction, which had apparently been the project all along. What the Yoon family had done to her to make her capable of that, Jiwon didn't know and didn't seek to know. Some architectures you don't need the blueprints for to understand what they built. He testified twice before the month ended. sat in formal rooms and answered questions from prosecutors and defense attorneys with the same plain candor he'd brought to Wu's interview room. And when the defense attorneys tried to shake him or reframe him or suggest that his cooperation was itself a kind of strategy, he looked at them and told the truth, and the truth was stable enough that it didn't require defending. Wu told him afterward, in the corridor, "You're either the most honest criminal I've ever dealt with or the best actor." "I'm trying to be neither," Jiwan said. Wu looked at him with the seasoned skepticism of his profession. "What are you trying to be?" Jiwan thought about it. "Someone my kids aren't ashamed of," he said. Eventually, Wu made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh if he'd been the kind of man who let things get that far. "Good luck," he said. "Thank you," Jiwan said, and meant it. The boutique reopened on a Thursday in January. A quiet reopening. No event, no press, just the lights on, and the sign flipped and Zarya behind the counter, with Dana arranging the pieces that had been recovered from the ballroom, and the pieces that hadn't been recovered being replaced by new work, because Zarya had spent the intervening weeks designing rather than waiting, converting the last of the anger into gold and platinum and the clean lines of the Trident Collection's second iteration. Jiwan came at noon, when it was quiet. He brought coffee from the place 2 blocks down that Elias had identified as the best because it had a dog outside that you could pet while you waited. He set a cup on the counter in front of Zarya without ceremony, and she picked it up and drank without looking up from what she was doing, which he understood as the particular intimacy of people who have stopped performing ease around each other and started actually having it. He looked at the new pieces in the display case. The second Trident collection had done something that the first had only gestured toward. It had a completeness to it, a sense of something arrived at rather than being arrived at, the difference between potential and realization. "These are better," he said. She looked up. "Than before," he clarified. "The gala pieces were extraordinary. These are better." She looked at the pieces with the slightly tilted assessment. She turned on her own work when she was deciding whether it had gotten where she intended. "I made them angry," she said. "The first collection, the gala pieces. I made them while I was angry, and you could feel it. That was the appeal, I think. That tension." She looked at the new display. "These I made after." "After is better," he said. "After usually is," she said. He began coming to the boutique most mornings. Not every morning. She hadn't asked for every morning. And he was learning the difference between what he wanted to do and what was actually being invited. But most mornings, with coffee, sitting at the client table near the window and doing work of his own, the legitimate consulting work he'd begun building, financial restructuring for businesses that needed it, the skill set he'd spent 15 years honing for purposes that had now been redirected. It was not glamorous work, it was careful, detailed, and slow. And he found that he didn't mind the slowness. The boys came to the boutique after school on the days Zarya needed them there. Elias always burst through the door with the full-body announcement of his arrival. Micah always came in behind him, looked at Jiwan, nodded once in the way he had that was both more and less than a greeting, and went to his spot at the low work table. Jiwan learned crazy eights. He was bad at it for approximately 1 week, and then Elias's teaching became sufficiently systematic that he improved, and Micah's quiet observation from the other side of the table contributed context that he suspected Micah was providing deliberately, though Micah would never confirm it. He learned the school drop-off route. He learned that Elias needed a 10-minute wind-down before sleeping, or the sleep didn't take, and that Micah could fall asleep anywhere with his book on his chest, and his face composed into something that looked like a smaller version of the face Jiwan saw in the mirror. He learned that Zarya drank her coffee too hot and read 2 books simultaneously, one serious and one not, and switched between them based on criteria he couldn't discern. He learned that she laughed at things she found genuinely funny, not socially funny. A real laugh, full and unmanaged, that he had heard exactly 4 times in their first incarnation and had been trying to get back to ever since. The 4th time he heard it in the new configuration, late February, Elias had told a joke that was structurally nonsensical, but delivered with such conviction that it somehow landed. Jiwan looked at her laughing and felt something complete itself in his chest, some long open circuit finally closing. She caught him looking. He didn't look away, neither did she. On a Sunday in March, the boys had a school project. Elias's class had been asked to draw their family, and Elias had approached the assignment with his characteristic conviction. He'd been working on it for 2 days, which for Elias constituted unusual dedication. He spread it out on the kitchen table that Sunday afternoon with the ceremony of a presenter who knows they've done good work. It was in crayon, elaborate for a 5-year-old. There were crayon chandeliers and a crayon boutique and crayon figures of Zaria and Micah and Elias himself, all rendered with the confident imprecision of someone who knows exactly what they're drawing, even if the materials don't fully cooperate. And on the right side of the picture, standing next to Zaria, a figure that was taller than the others, with dark crayon hair and a suit that Elias had clearly put a great deal of effort into. Under the figure, in letters that were careful and deliberate and slightly uneven in the way of children who are still learning that letters have to stay on the line, Dad. Jiwon looked at the word for a moment. Micah, across the table, had his own version of the project in front of him. His was less elaborate, more architectural. The figures were simpler, the backgrounds minimal, but there was a precision to the placement of things that made it feel considered. He had drawn the same people, the same configuration. And under the tall figure on the right, in handwriting that was already, at 5, more controlled than his brother's, Dad. He hadn't shown it to anyone. He'd set it on the table and was looking at it with the slight frown of someone who is deciding whether a thing is finished. He looked up and found Jiwon looking at the drawing. He looked at Jiwon for a moment with those eyes. Then he looked back at the drawing, picked up a brown crayon, and added something. A detail at the figure's collarbone, small, precise. Jiwon looked and saw that it was a crystal piece, like the one from the ballroom, the one that Elias still kept on the windowsill in his room, turning it in the light when he thought no one was watching. Micah capped the crayon and set it down and looked at Jiwon. "It's done now," he said. Jiwon looked at the drawing for another moment. His throat was doing something he had not agreed to. He said, with more steadiness than he actually had, "It's good." Micah shrugged in the way he shrugged, which was its own form of satisfaction. He stacked his paper on top of Elias's and pushed them to the side of the table and opened his book. Zaria was at the counter with her back to the table, doing something with a piece she'd been working on all week. She had gone very still in the way that Jiwon now knew meant she'd heard something and was deciding where to put it. After a moment, she turned around. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen light. She looked at him, and he looked at her. And between them the whole year moved. The boutique and the parkade and the ballroom and the Gapyong kitchen and the police building at 4 in the morning and the coffee cups and the card games and every morning that had accumulated into something neither of them had been able to name while they were building it. She picked up the piece she'd been working on and walked to the table and set it in front of him. It was a ring. Platinum. A central stone flanked by 2 smaller ones in the trident setting, but this one different from the original. The stones positioned not as though held in a current, but as though orbiting something, as though the center of gravity was the space between them rather than any single stone. He looked at it for a long time. "I'm not proposing," she said, and her voice was dry enough to be Zaria and real enough to be the truth. "I'm not there yet. I want to be clear about that." "Okay," he said. "I made it because I needed to make it, because I had the shape of it in my head and it needed to exist." She looked at the ring. "I made the first trident because I was angry. I made this one because I'm not." She paused. "Not anymore." He looked at it. 3 stones. Not in motion, in relationship. The specific and particular weight of things that have found their position relative to each other and settled into it. "It's the best thing you've made," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said, and there was something in it that wasn't just about the ring. Outside the kitchen window, the March afternoon was doing what March afternoons did in Seoul, struggling between winter and something else. The light thin and genuine, the air still cold but carrying in it the specific suggestion of a temperature that was on its way to being different. Not warm yet, not resolved, moving. Elias had taken the crystal piece from his pocket. He carried it everywhere now, the way children carry talismans, and was holding it to the window, and the light moved through it across the table, small and specific, and not quite like anything else. Micah turned a page. Jiwon looked at Zaria. She looked back at him. The ring sat on the table between them, not an answer, not yet a question. Something more honest than either. A shape that had been in someone's head and needed to exist. A center of gravity between 3 stones that had found their orbits. Outside, the light kept moving. Inside the kitchen, very quietly, something that had been broken for 5 years, finished the long work of becoming something else. Not fixed, not restored. Different. The way metal is different after it's been through fire and come back. Stronger in the places it fractured, marked by what it survived, holding a shape that could only have come from exactly the breaking it went through. Micah turned another page and said, without looking up, "Next Sunday, can we go to the park?" Elias looked up from the crystal. "The one with the big slide?" "Yes." Elias looked at Jiwan. "Do you know how to do the big slide?" Jiwan considered this. "I can learn," he said. Elias seemed to find this the correct answer. He turned back to the window and held the crystal up again, and the light scattered across the ceiling in small, moving pieces, and the afternoon held them all. The woman at the table and the man across from her and the two boys who had been, since before they had language for it, the gravity that everything else had been orbiting all along.